Look at any photograph of a major American city taken before 1900. The streets are largely unpaved. The sidewalks are dirt or wood plank. Horse-drawn carts outnumber pedestrians. And yet, rising above all of it, sometimes on the very edge of a half-built settlement, there is a building. Not a modest building. A domed, colonnaded, stone-faced structure of significant scale. Designed for thousands. Built before there were thousands. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. The standard explanation is straightforward: civic ambition. Cities built big to signal confidence, to attract settlers, to project permanence. Governments and developers borrowed heavily, hired architects from established eastern cities, and constructed institutions ahead of need. It was aspiration made architectural. That explanation holds. Until you look at the numbers. In 1853, the city of Chicago had a population of approximately 60,000 people. That same year, construction was underway on a city hall complex whose interior square footage exceeded 100,000 square feet. The building was designed to process a civic population several times the size of the one that existed. The architects were not local. The stone was not local. The construction timeline was not consistent with what frontier labor supply would typically allow. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the pattern. Across the American Midwest and parts of the South, records from the 1840s through the 1870s document a consistent sequence. Civic structures precede population density by margins that, in some cases, span decades. A post office built in 1851 for a town that would not reach the size to require it until 1889. A customs house completed in 1857 for a port that handled a fraction of the trade volume it was engineered to accommodate. Researchers who study early American infrastructure have noted this gap. Most frame it as optimism. Some frame it as something else. Scale tells one story. Timing tells another. Consider the pace of construction. In the mid-19th century, quarrying, transporting, and placing large-cut stone required significant coordination, equipment, logistics, skilled labor. The construction of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, for example, began in 1858 and was not completed until 1879. 21 years for a single landmark structure. Yet across the same period, smaller cities with a fraction of New York's labor pool, financial resources, and infrastructure, completed comparable civic buildings in 3 to 5 years. Sometimes fewer. The labor records for some of these projects are incomplete. Payroll documentation is missing or thin. The number of workers listed does not always correspond with the speed of completion. Some researchers have flagged this as administrative casualness, a normal feature of frontier record keeping. Others have simply noted the discrepancy and moved on. But the discrepancy exists. And it is not confined to one region. Look at the internal systems. Many of these mid-19th century civic buildings were not just structurally large. They were technically sophisticated. Ventilation shafts. Pneumatic tube networks for internal communication. Heating systems embedded in the floors and walls. Systems that, in some cases, were not widely documented in American construction manuals of the period. Acoustic designs that remain studied by architecture students today. The question is not whether these systems existed. They clearly did. They are still present in some of the buildings that survive. The question that some architectural historians have raised, quietly and carefully, is about sequencing. These technologies appeared in civic buildings before they appeared in the construction literature that was supposed to have inspired them. The buildings came first. The documented engineering knowledge, in some cases, followed. That is a strange order. There is a tendency, when examining 19th century American civic architecture, to see each building as a product of its specific city, its specific donors, its specific political moment. And many of them were. But if you step back and look at the pattern geographically, if you map the cities where civic structures significantly outpaced population, where construction timelines appear compressed, where internal systems appeared ahead of documented spread, something shifts. The buildings are not random. They cluster. Not just in the largest cities, but in mid-sized cities, in towns that were still being platted when their civic centers were already rising. The clustering is consistent enough that it has attracted sustained attention from a small but serious community of researchers studying early American urban development. They have noted that the buildings share not just a scale anomaly, but an aesthetic consistency. Certain facade ratios, certain column proportions, certain dome geometries that appear in cities that, by the historical record, had no documented communication with one another during the period of construction. One researcher described it as a template without a traceable origin. This is not an argument. It is an observation about records. What the records show is that in city after city, across a 30 to 50-year window in the mid-19th century, civic buildings of exceptional scale and technical sophistication appeared faster than the surrounding cities could logically account for, faster than the population demanded, faster than the documented labor could produce, and in some cases, equipped with systems that preceded their own documented development. Each individual case has an explanation. Each timeline gap has a candidate cause. Each missing labor record has a reasonable interpretation. But the pattern, taken together, is harder to settle. And the pattern does not stop at American borders. If the American examples were isolated, products of frontier ambition, speculative investment, or the particular chaos of westward expansion, then the pattern would be containable. It would belong to a specific moment in a specific country with specific conditions. Historians could point to the land grants, the railroad money, the political theater of civic construction, and close the file. But the same sequence appears in England. Not in the industrial north alone, where the logic of boomtown optimism might apply. In market towns. In cathedral cities that had been largely stable for 200 years before the Victorian era began. In places where there was no railroad speculation, no frontier mythology, no particular reason to build beyond existing need. Manchester's Town Hall, completed in 1877, was designed for a municipal administration significantly larger than the one that occupied it at the time of opening. The building's internal layout, its committee rooms, its vaulted circulation corridors, were scaled for an institutional complexity that Manchester's civic government would not reach for another 2 decades. Alfred Waterhouse, the architect, left extensive documentation. The commission itself is well recorded. And yet the scale decision, building so far ahead of demonstrated need, is typically attributed to confidence in industrial growth. Confidence, again. Ambition, again. The explanation is available. Whether it fully accounts for the arithmetic is a different question. What makes the British examples worth examining alongside the American ones is not that they are mysterious in isolation. It is that they are consistent in pattern. In both countries, across the same general period, roughly 1840 to 1890, civic buildings appeared with these recurring characteristics: scale that exceeded contemporary population by a measurable margin, construction timelines that, when examined against available labor and material logistics, appear compressed, internal systems of ventilation, acoustics, and heating that represented the leading edge of engineering knowledge at the time, and in some cases slightly ahead of it. In Leeds, a municipal building completed in 1858 contained an internal heating system whose design closely resembled one that would be formally published and widely adopted only in the 1870s. The local explanation was that the contractor sourced an innovative approach from a contact in Germany. The contact has not been documented. The system works. These are not dramatic revelations. They are small frictions in the record. But they accumulate. Infrastructure is particularly instructive. In the United States, the argument for building ahead of need often rests on railroad logic. Build the terminus, and the city will follow. There is genuine evidence for this model. It worked, in documented cases, in precisely that sequence. But civic infrastructure is different from transit infrastructure. A rail terminus generates economic activity that then generates population. A city hall does not. A customs house does not generate the trade it was built to process. A post office does not generate the correspondence it was designed to handle. These buildings were not investments in economic attraction. They were administrative structures. And administrative structures, by definition, serve existing administrative demand, not future demand. Building a post office 5 times the size of your current postal volume is not a strategy. It is a decision that requires explanation. In several American cities, those explanations exist in the records. Donors insisted on grandeur. Architects oversold. Federal appropriations were spent in full regardless of local need. These are real phenomena and they account for real cases. What they do not fully account for is the consistency. When the same pattern, same scale anomaly, same timeline compression, same technical sophistication, appears in city after city, country after country, the explanations begin to feel less like causes and more like categories. Ways of naming the gap without closing it. The UK examples add a dimension that the American cases alone cannot provide. England in the mid-19th century was not a frontier. It had established architectural traditions, stable construction guilds, documented engineering lineages, and institutional records that are among the most complete in the world for that period. If anomalies exist in American records, a skeptic can reasonably point to the chaos of rapid expansion. No such excuse applies to a market town in Yorkshire. And yet the anomalies appear there too. Civic halls in towns that were not growing rapidly. Library buildings in communities whose documented literacy rates at the time of construction would not have justified the scale. Reading rooms and assembly halls built for a public participation that, by the electoral and census records of the period, did not yet exist. One architectural historian studying Victorian civic construction in northern England described the phenomenon with careful neutrality. These buildings appear to have been designed for a civic culture slightly in advance of the one that was present. Slightly in advance. That phrase does a great deal of work. There is another layer. When you examine the architectural firms responsible for these buildings, both in the US and the UK, a pattern of overlap emerges that is not, on its own, remarkable. Architecture was a small professional world. Firms trained apprentices who became partners who started their own firms. Ideas traveled. Aesthetic influences spread. But some researchers studying the civic building boom have noted that certain design decisions, specific proportional systems, specific facade treatments, specific choices about dome height relative to base width, appear in buildings designed by firms with no documented connection to one another. Not a general aesthetic similarity. A specific geometric consistency. The standard interpretation is convergence, multiple architects independently arriving at similar solutions because similar problems produce similar answers. It is a reasonable explanation. It is also the kind of explanation that is very difficult to disprove, and therefore very easy to apply wherever a pattern is inconvenient. Some researchers who have catalogued these patterns, the scale anomalies, the timeline compressions, the technical precocity, the geometric consistencies, have begun to group them under a broader interpretive label. They use this label not as a conclusion, not as a claim about what happened, but as a way of asking whether these patterns, taken together, point towards something that existing historical frameworks have not yet satisfactorily addressed. That label has a name, and it is one that mainstream scholarship treats with significant caution, for reasons that are themselves worth examining. The word Tartaria appears in maps. This is not a fringe claim. It is a cartographic fact. On European maps produced from the 16th through the 18th centuries, a vast designation, Tartaria, or Tartary, covers enormous portions of the Asian continent, stretching in some versions from Eastern Europe to the Pacific coast. It appears on maps published by reputable European cartographic houses. It is referenced in diplomatic correspondence, in merchant travel accounts, in the journals of Jesuit missionaries. It is, by the documentary record, a real geographic designation that real institutions used for real administrative purposes. What it designated, precisely, is where interpretation begins to diverge. The conventional scholarly position is that Tartaria was a European catch-all term, a cartographic shorthand for the vast, loosely organized territories beyond the borders of known Eurasian powers. Not a unified civilization. Not an empire with a capital and a bureaucracy. A label applied by outsiders to a geography they understood only partially, populated by peoples they categorized broadly and often inaccurately. The term, in this reading, says more about European cartographic limitations than about anything that existed on the ground. This is the mainstream position. It is held by serious historians. It rests on substantial evidence. And it is, for most academic purposes, sufficient. But a separate body of researchers, working largely outside institutional history, though not entirely, has looked at the same cartographic record and asked a different set of questions. Not, what did Europeans mean when they wrote this word? But, what, if anything, was present in those territories that might have generated a designation of that scale and consistency? Their argument is not that Tartaria was a secret empire whose existence was deliberately concealed. That framing, which circulates in more sensational corners of the internet, is not what the more careful researchers in this space are advancing. The careful version of the argument is narrower and, for that reason, harder to dismiss. It goes like this. The civic buildings examined in Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this inquiry share characteristics, scale, technical sophistication, geometric consistency, that suggest a common source of knowledge or design influence. That source, whatever it was, is not clearly documented in the historical record as it currently stands. The Tartaria designation, appearing on maps of precisely the period before the civic building boom, represents a large geographic and institutional unknown. Some researchers suggest these two gaps, the undocumented design source, and the cartographically acknowledged but poorly understood territory, may be worth examining in relation to one another. That is a hypothesis. It is not a conclusion. It is worth being precise about what this hypothesis does and does not claim. It does not claim that a hidden empire built America's courthouses. It does not claim that any government deliberately removed evidence of a prior civilization. It does not claim that the people labeled Tartars in European maps were architects of a global civic project. What some researchers do suggest is that the 19th century was a period of significant knowledge transfer, that architectural and engineering traditions from territories not well documented in Western institutional history may have reached Western builders through channels that are not fully recorded. Trade routes. Diplomatic missions. The movement of craftsmen across borders that were, in this period, considerably more porous than later nationalist histories tend to acknowledge. One interpretation is that what we call the Victorian civic building boom was not purely a product of Victorian ambition. That some of what was built drew on all the technical knowledge whose origin point is not cleanly traceable to the European or American institutions that built the buildings. Tartaria, in this reading, is not a civilization to be recovered. It is a placeholder, a name for the gap. There are serious objections to this line of inquiry, and they deserve honest presentation. The first is evidentiary. The buildings exist. The records, incomplete as they are, generally support conventional explanations. Scale anomalies can be accounted for by donor ambition and speculative investment. Timeline compressions can be accounted for by record-keeping gaps common to the period. Technical sophistication can be accounted for by knowledge transfer through documented channels. The movement of European-trained engineers to American and British projects is well attested. The second objection is methodological. Pattern recognition across incomplete datasets is unreliable. The human mind is exceptionally good at finding consistency in noise. A researcher looking for geometric similarity across 19th-century civic buildings will find it, because the aesthetic conventions of the period were themselves consistent, trained through the same architectural schools, the same pattern books, the same publications circulating across the same professional networks. These objections are legitimate. Any honest examination of this material has to hold them fully. What they do not do, entirely, is dissolve the questions. The evidentiary objections explain individual cases. They are less persuasive as explanations for the aggregate. When every anomaly has a candidate explanation, but the anomalies continue to cluster in the same place, across the same period, with the same characteristics, the candidate explanations begin to function as a category rather than a cause. The methodological objection, that pattern recognition is unreliable, applies equally to the dismissal of the pattern. If we are cautious about seeing meaning in clusters of similarity, we should be equally cautious about the confidence with which those clusters are explained away. This is not an argument for any particular conclusion. It is an argument for precision about what we know, what we infer, and what we have simply chosen to stop asking about. The civic buildings are still there. Some of them have been repurposed. Some are museums. Some still function as the institutions they were designed to house, courthouses, post offices, city halls, though the populations they now serve are exactly what the buildings always seem to anticipate. Eventually, the cities caught up. Whether the buildings were simply built ahead of their time, or whether they were built with a knowledge of time that we have not fully accounted for. That question sits in the record, unresolved, the way many historical questions do. Not dramatically, not urgently, but persistently. The maps still show the word. The buildings still stand larger than they needed to be. And the gap between what the records show and what the records explain remains exactly where it has always been. Quietly open. The questions exist independently. The label is one attempt to collect them. The mainstream historical response to these observations takes several forms. The most common is to emphasize the documented growth trajectories of institutionalized populations. Asylums that appeared overbuilt in their first decade were, in many cases, genuinely full within 2 or 3 decades. The Coney Hatch Asylum, built for 1,200, housed over 2,500 patients by the 1890s. The Three Counties Asylum, expanded repeatedly, eventually housed more than 1,600. The scale, in retrospect, was not excessive, it was simply early. This is a reasonable rebuttal. It draws on real numbers. It explains the outcome. What it explains less cleanly is the specificity of initial engineering, the ventilation systems calculated for full occupancy from day one, the water infrastructure sized for populations that took 30 years to materialize, the underground utility corridors built complete and not extended. Outcomes can vindicate scale. They do not automatically vindicate the precision of engineering that anticipated that scale before the population existed to justify it.